Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to the NASEP workshop for February 21st, 2022. And we are joined today by Nicholas Wilson. And this is on imposter syndrome, the importance of Indigenous remembrance within the Academy. So we're going to be going over um, who we are and remembering where we come from through this workshop. And um, for if you have any questions, please raise your hand. And is there anything I forgot, Carol? Nope. All right. I will hand it over to Nick. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you today. It's really great to see some relations that I haven't seen in a while. My name is Nicholas Wilson. I am a fourth-year PhD student in the University of Arizona Center for the Study of Higher Education. It's a real honor to be with all of you today. And as Natalia pointed out, I'll be speaking about imposter syndrome, but doing it in an interesting way by talking about the importance of Indigenous remembrance within the Academy. And again, I think the reason I picked this topic was just recognizing the importance of, again, remembering who we are, where we come from, but more specifically, what is the knowledge system that we as Indigenous peoples, where did that come from, and where is that in relation to who we are and how we understand ourselves? So again, what I'm going to do is just kind of quickly move us forward. But as you can see on the screen are some images of myself over the last 5 or 6 years as I've been on this journey from my master's program into my PhD. But what I'll be reflecting on is a longer journey, talking about what it would mean when I first started the University of Arizona way back in 1995, and my 14-year journey to actually complete my undergraduate degree, then began working for the institution, but then what did it mean to come back as a master's student and then move into a PhD program? So this has been a long journey beginning. So it's about a 26 and a half year journey that I've been on to move from becoming a college student to where I hope to eventually become, which is having a PhD in higher education and being a full-fledged professor at an institution of higher learning. So what I'm going to do is just move us forward here, give us this kind of a path forward here. So again, what will we be talking about today? So what you see on the screen is actually an image that was taken when I was part of a community here at the University of Arizona called Engaging Native Boys. This was an ongoing project where we were trying to understand what engages Indigenous men in education from middle school all the way to college, but we also looked at individuals who, as we say, got pushed out of the system for various reasons. And so we've been in community with a lot of these young men over the years, and it's been really nice to just be in constant conversation with them about various topics. Our most recent one was focused on Indigenous lessons in loss and love, which was last Saturday. We decided to do a reflective piece to just understand what does it mean for us as Indigenous men to be dealing with loss at this point as a result of the pandemic that's happening currently. And so again, we had a really great dialogue. We were fortunate to bring together and have another group come in and listen to us called the Honor Collective here in Tucson, which is a group of Indigenous women who get together on a regular basis, also have deep, meaningful conversations about various things. And so they stepped in and got to hear us have our conversation and also contribute their own thoughts and ideas around the topic of Indigenous lessons of love and loss. So again, that's just, again, the image that you see here. So what we'll do is there's a space for us to introduce ourselves as Indigenous intellectual relations, but also, again, I'll reflect on this idea of what is Indigenous intellectual kinship. It's a concept I always kind of bring up and shared with my students to talk about how do you take pieces and works and bring them together? How do you take thoughts and ideas from one Indigenous scholar, another Indigenous scholar, and begin to like bring them together into something that we refer to in the Academy as a theoretical framework? How do you borrow ideas and structure a new way of looking at the world yourself, or again, the reality in which we live in? So I'll kind of break it down into something, again, as I call establishing an Indigenous intellectual kinship with the people that I've read and also that I've been in community with. Then we'll go into this idea of remembering Indigenous intellectual kinship systems, where I'll really draw on the specific scholars that become the foundational framework upon which I've been doing a lot of my work, but also my deeper understanding about who I am, the world, and again, what does it mean to live in this reality? The one thing that we'll speak about is also this idea of relearning and remembering how to survive within the academy, talking about the various things that I struggled with when I left home and was suddenly away from home as a first generation poor socioeconomic status student here on campus. And how did I negotiate the separation from my community, what it did for me, but also sometimes we speak about historical and contemporary forms of trauma. That is part of my story, and I'll be speaking about some of that and what it has meant to kind of address that. But also, what does it mean to go back to this idea of remembering who we were as Indigenous peoples and who we still are? Because again, we are vibrant, we're alive, we exist, we continue to exist. But again, sometimes we're in spaces like this, we don't get a chance to center our own Indigenous ways of knowing, understanding, and being. And sometimes we forget who we are unintentionally, but sometimes as a result of systems of oppression that are out there that force us to forget or require us to forget as part of, again, this process. But again, as I mentioned, there's a journey there that I returned back to my own understanding. And what does it mean now to have that and be able to view the world as close as I can, but I'm still working towards getting back to the ways in which my own people saw ourselves. That again takes some more research, more doing in another talk, but at least again, we're just kind of talking about some of the things that have come up since then for me. And the last, we'll just begin with something called a piece that I wrote for a presentation I did with another group of Indigenous scholars. So as I mentioned before, part of the tradition that I was raised with was always being community with people, serving, being alongside, and also again, sharing knowledge. And so what I'll do is just kind of talk about a recent presentation I gave with a group of what we refer to as Indigenous thinkers at the University of Arizona. It's a group of Indigenous scholars who took a class with one specific and Indigenous professor. And as a result of that, we decided to submit for a conference and got to go to Baltimore to talk about what does it mean to be Indigenous, what our thoughts around Indigenous rhetorical sovereignty were. And so I'll share some of my presentation from that, but bring back to like a written piece that I wrote and use that as an opportunity to just enter in dialogue with the rest of you and just hear your thoughts and ideas around all of this as well. So to move us forward, I'm going to officially introduce myself in the way in which my community taught me. So Yat Shea Nicholas Wilson and Shia, Sandra Kinenishle, Tabaha Bashichin, Tachini Dashiche, Ado Shin Dashinele, Akut Ego Dene Nishle, Tucson, Arizona Gaeshta, Ne, Waikon, Arizona Denasha, Ehaha. So what you've heard was me introducing myself in Navajo. This is how my grandparents taught me to introduce myself. It recognizes the 4 parts of my clan that make up who I am. And at the bottom of the screen, you actually see the English translation for what I've shared. When I look at this, what I think about is just all the levels of knowledge that is shared here, the idea of the place where you come from, where you were born, but also where you live and work, but also the idea of who are your relations, who are the people that have constructed your understanding, not only about the world, but again, how you learn to be and behave and act as an Indigenous person. And what you see at the top of the screen are just images of myself. It's always, I use this slide to kind of be a reminder to myself that again, I'm on this lifelong journey of trying to understand what does it mean to be an Indigenous male in this world, but also again, this idea that I use it at work to just say I'm a product of Indian education from my birth all the way up into my current PhD program. So again, just something fun there. And what I'm going to do is just give a space for all of us to introduce ourselves. So I'll step back. If you want to unmute your microphone, I guess we can start with Natalia and then maybe go to Rudy, Carol, and then Kayla. Feel free to introduce yourself however you'd like. It just gives me a chance to get to know all of you since we'll be spending some time together. So I'll step back. Thanks.
Thank you, Nick. Kumathum. My name is Natalia Kachora. I come from the Fort Yuma San Indian Reservation. My clan is Havatsat, which is Frog Clan on my dad's side, and I am Turtle Clan on my mom's side. And currently I live in Tucson, and I am a graduate student for the Native American Science and Engineering program. And I am getting my master's degree in development practice, which is international development with a emphasis in air quality, as well as getting a certificate in geographical information sciences. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rudy McCormick, and I work as director for the Office of Early Academic Outreach, and longtime Tucsonan. So I've lived in Tucson most all of my life, a couple of years in California, but most of my life here in Tucson, Arizona. My dad grew up in Tucson, and then my mom migrated to the United States from Chihuahua, Mexico. And so I was also going to just share that I've had an opportunity to work on campus for a good number of years. I did my degrees in psychology and family studies as an undergraduate, and had the opportunity to do a master's degree in higher education as well. I'll turn it over.
Ja, it's a Carol Sines in a shack in the chin, Shadona Kai Bash's chin, to a glini edish shade on a Kai edish nole, Akut ego to nesta initially. So I said, my name's Carol Sines. I said all four of my clans. My mother's side, it's the water or the Red House clan and water flows together people. And on my father's side, it's I'm Mexican. I've lived in Arizona. Sorry, I've lived in Tucson the past 10 years, and I'm from the Winter Rock, St. Michael's area. I'm currently studying a master's in science and epidemiology, and yeah, I'll turn it over to Michaela.
Hello, I'm Michaela. I'm a sophomore here at U of A. I'm majoring in criminal justice. I'm a sophomore, but also first year student, but by credits, I'm a sophomore. Yeah.
Thank you all. I also see we're joined by Natasha. So if you'd like to introduce yourself, Natasha. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Natasha. I don't know how to, or I forgot how to introduce myself in Navajo. I just know my first clan, which is Quogue. But other than that, I forgot everything else. But I'm Natasha Thompson. I'm in 11th grade this year. Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us. So, well, thank you. I'm going to move us forward. It's a pleasure to spend this time with all of you. So I just want to situate this idea of remembering Indigenous intellectual kinship systems. So what I do this when I was teaching a class at the University of Arizona, I was teaching my students that one of the things that we must do in the academy sometimes is we have to learn how to take thoughts and ideas that are contained with some of the books that we've read, and how do we bring those together? How do we, again, use those ideas and build something from it? And so part of my research has been to really relies heavily on these four Indigenous scholars here. So I just kind of walk you through like what and situate what I've come to know and understand through all of this work. So again, what the very first one you see on the left is one by Vine Deloria Jr. and Daniel R. Wildcat, which was written in 2001 called Power and Place, Indian Education in America. And I think the reason I also thought this was appropriate is we're talking about NASEP, we're talking about science. And so one of the very first early chapters in this book really speaks to this idea of we're speaking about Indigenous metaphysics. We're not really speaking about Indian science. And what they mean by that was this idea that what we as like intellectuals think about is metaphysics is this understanding of how do you explain everything, and that everything is related in some way. And so when they were speaking, they're just saying that, yes, we can think about things and use the phrase native science, but it really is kind of taking away the overall broader conceptual understandings that we speak of when we think about things at a very intellectual level. I guess what this is saying is that our people as indigenous peoples were highly intelligent. They had this really vast understanding of the cosmos, the universe, the earth, ourselves as human beings, but also our other relations, the plants, the animals, all the things that make this reality what it is. And so what they were trying to make this argument about was the idea that if you focus on just the science, you're missing the bigger picture. You're missing the overall thing. And what I love about the work is contained within it is Vine Deloria's attempt to explain what is indigenous metaphysics. And what he does is he begins to break it down into a simple equation called power plus place equals personality. The idea that power speaks to all of the life energy that exists anywhere within the cosmos, but place being what are the energies and life forces within a specific location? What are those? And then personality was the idea that when you get down to that very local level and you start to look at all the various forms of life that are there, the human, the plants, the animals, the mountains, the rivers, the streams, all of them have a sense of personality that when they're sharing space together, create a certain feel. Much like we have a very specific feel today with all the relations that are joining us today, and how if there were other people, this space would feel a little different because now we have other people joining us. So this was something, again, that they spend quite a bit of time speaking to, but what they really speak to really mostly is the idea that for indigenous peoples, what makes us different in our understanding is this belief that we actually are part of a living, breathing universe. It has its own energies, its own life force, and we're part of it. We're just one little part of a larger and larger social cosmic forces and systems that we have yet to understand. So again, that's what gets situated there. But when we start moving over to VF Cordova, who's another scholar I really love, she is a Western trained indigenous philosopher, meaning she went through the academy, got a PhD in Western philosophy. And I recall one of the things that stood out to me was she just said, I wanted to learn how others thought, but specifically how settler colonial people thought. So that's when she went into this study of philosophy. How do Western, or what we can refer to as settler colonial people, individuals who are elsewhere, who came into this land, how did they conceptualize themselves, the world, and everything on another half of the world with their own relations and other people? And what she does is she breaks it down to something very simple, which is this idea of a matrix. The idea that every culture, whether they're labeled modern or primitive, have three foundational definitions. They have a definition of the world, the definition of a human being in that world, and the definition of the role of a human being in that world. And as a result of all of that, we begin to then create a framework or a matrix that she says, or a window. She speaks about this creation of a window that exists as a result of those definitions. And that over the years, what has happened is that that window gets constructed by previous generations based on our creation story, the thoughts and ideas that emerge from that, the logic systems, the way just everything works. And so from there, what she then begins to speak about is just what is common amongst all of these indigenous peoples of what we refer to as North America. What, if we know that these are the foundational definitions, what can we find from that? And so she begins to explore that, but also at the same time exploring the Western creation system and starting to look at those foundational definitions and really start to compare the two and say, we have a group of individuals with who came from elsewhere, who always believed that they were created elsewhere and treat the earth in a very different way, because in their mind, they see their place here on earth as being different than how we as indigenous people see ourselves. What we do is we see ourselves as actually come from the earth itself. We emerge from it. We are a product of a mother, and that's how we actually label the earth. And so she begins to tease out all of those things to say, what does it mean to have this belief that the earth and the universe is alive? And beautifully walks through all of that, but then begins to situate this idea of reality. When we start speaking about indigenous peoples, though, she had to ask that question of what reality are you speaking to? because we have to recognize that, again, each Indigenous community has its own sense of reality based on their creation stories, their traditions, the songs, the dances, which all become part of a pedagogy, or the things that are taught, and how that window that I referred to gets constructed and passed on is through all of that. But she also brings up this idea that, again, when we start to look at reality, we also have to look at who we are, our identity. And as Indigenous peoples, what we've come to learn is that our identity is also tied to the places that we live, the lands that we come from, and that all the knowledge that our peoples have come to know over millennia, since time immemorial. There's a lot of information there. So how do you store it? And what I've come to learn through all of my research is it gets stored in the land. There's specific places where stories are told. There's specific times of year when certain stories are shared by elders with children, because there's certain rules and protocols that say this is the time that you can speak about specific forms of life because they're present. So there's rules like that that exist, but they do vary from Indigenous culture and tribes themselves, but there's still that commonality. There's still a common framework and definitions that bring it all together. And that, again, also brings up this idea that when we speak about reality, we have to recognize that Indigenous people's reality is very different than the reality in which we exist in right now, because as one of our scholars that I like to speak about, Brian Brayboy, speaks about, is the idea that settler colonialism, this idea of other people's ways of thinking that began and developed elsewhere on the other half of the world, but made its way over here and began to have influence upon the ways Indigenous people see themselves, the land, the relationships with each other, their kinship system, all of that. So that just kind of fast forwards into the Gregory Cajete piece, which talks about community-based, the idea that through all of this, metaphysics has to be taught, the philosophy also has to be taught, but how do you teach that? You teach it, again, by being in community with one another, where community is the medium and the message of all of this knowledge. It's the idea of how am I related to not just all the human beings that are part of your community, but how am I related to the other forms of life that come from our Mother Earth? We are also a product of her, very much like they are. So they're related to us. And so that's some of the things that get spoken about here, is that community-based form of education that, again, didn't just focus on human experience, but again, our relationship to all other forms of life as well. And then fast forward to Dr. Kathleen Absalon at the very end. So this is where this idea of Indigenous research comes up, speaking about this idea that, again, this reality, this way of knowing, understanding, and being that was unique to each of our respective Indigenous communities, how as a result of contact or settler colonialism coming over, that these two windows, in a sense, have been fighting with one another. And one has been forcefully going after another and destroying those windows, or these matrices that she speaks of. So they talk about the idea that these initial thoughts and understanding Indigenous peoples had about themselves existed, but when settler colonialism came in, then suddenly it became fragmented. And so what she speaks about is this idea of Indigenous research, that Indigenous scholars who come to the Academy come here looking for questions about themselves or a sense of who they are, and will go through a research project and use ceremony and traditional methods to construct their own knowledge in a very different way. But also she brings up the point that what they're looking for are remnants of our own understanding of who we are as individuals, but as collectively as peoples, and try to bring all of those pieces back so that we can try to recreate and remember that original matrix that our ancestors from long ago used to practice and used to partake in prior to, again, settler colonialism, which came in, created laws, governments, policies that, again, punished us for thinking and living our own way in our own truths, is an interesting way to think about it. So what I have at the bottom there is also Indigenous researching, this idea of searching, finding, and remembering Indigenous ways of knowing, understanding, and being. So that's really what I see my research has been, is how do I bring together all of these Indigenous scholars to say, here is our metaphysical foundation. Instead of using other non-Indigenous thought, I'm trying to bring the Indigenous metaphysics, pedagogy, philosophy, development, and all of these things together to say, this is what I know that the indigenous peoples of North America, this is how they situate reality, themselves, the world. It will vary by community to community, but at least it's a starting point to say this is the commonality here, but then scholars from here can start delving into their own respective traditions, cultures, and understanding and try to bring that back together. And there have been scholars who are already participating in doing that. So I'm just going to move us forward now and just thinking about some of the, I'm also trying to be respectful of time here, this idea of relearning and remembering how to survive in the academy. So what I have on here are just specific things I wanted to touch on. What was it like leaving my own indigenous homeland and my peoples? So as I mentioned, I left in 1995, came to the University of Arizona. I was a first generation college student. We were very poor. And to really situate how poor we were, there were times when my mother couldn't buy us gifts, even for our birthdays. So she would write us letters to just say, this is all I can afford to give you, our words on paper. And so when I left home and I came to this place, I was suddenly disconnected from that community of aunts, uncles, my mom, my dad, my relatives, this huge kinship system that I grew up with that cared for me, loved me, encouraged me. And suddenly I was far away from home and I couldn't even afford to go home. I was that poor. I was struggling to survive here in the academy, living in a dorm, living in a wing specifically with Native students as own. And what that led to was just becoming more and more depressed over the course of time. So after about my second year here at the University of Arizona, I stopped going to classes at one point during the semester. I basically flunked out of one entire semester. I had lost my tribal scholarship. And so I had to struggle with that feeling of being ashamed of, I did this, I was great at it, and now suddenly I'm not succeeding here. What will my family think? And that, do I keep this from them? Do I tell them? In many cases, I never did. But again, what we speak about too is just how the part that I have to situate too is the idea that with all of this happening, the other thing that was occurring at the time was I was dealing with all of these forms of trauma that I experienced as a child or that I witnessed. All I can say is that I grew up in a house where, again, physical, emotional, psychological abuse, alcoholism, these are all things, again, that are a result of settler colonialism that, again, people are coping and these are their coping mechanisms. It's hard to kind of situate and understand that. But now being at the point that I know my understanding, I recognize that the things that happened in my home were just people trying to live and survive because like others, my parents were taken from their parents and put in boarding schools and had that boarding school experience. And so they had their own traumas as a result of that, and it played out in these ways. And so as a child growing up, I was exposed to all of that. And then when I finally left home and I was here, these emotions, these things that I put off suddenly bubbled to the surface and they said, you're going to deal with us. Whether you like it or not, you can't go anywhere, you can't do anything. And I couldn't focus on school. I was just constantly worried about all of this past trauma. I eventually left the institution for about 8 years, went into the work world, finally came back and completed my degree in 2009. So that's where that 14-year journey happened, which again, just to quickly situate, it's kind of hard for me to think about because I was a near 4.0 high school student. I did dual enrollment and had 16 credits under my belt before I came to the University of Arizona. I did everything you were supposed to succeed. But again, life happened, these traumas came to the surface and just made it hard for me to focus. So again, what that has led though, is I've done some healing, went through therapy, resituated a lot of things, finished my degree, went working for the university, and then eventually got back into community, working with our American Indian Alumni Club, putting together a scholarship program, a mentorship program, and monthly workshops. And then in the midst of that, I realized I could be doing this better. So that's when I applied for my master's program in higher education, where again, I completed that and then went into my current PhD. But through that process, I began to have this opportunity to really begin to question the sense of what is reality, but also who am I and who am I becoming within the academy? Because again, it's really our relationships that we have with one another, the people that we speak to, interact with, they have an influence on that as well. And so again, remembering everything I've come to know and understand, like this is a unique position for me to be in, thinking about, as I tell people, I'm much older than most traditional college students, but again, this is my journey, this is where I'm at. But the beauty is that I refer to as I'm in the midpoint of my life, recognizing that if I get another 40 plus years out of my life, it would be amazing. And so again, just having all of this data, as I speak of, lived experience to reflect on. So I get to do that now and start to begin to really think about, how do I remember myself? How do I remember these experiences? And how do I bring this remembrance of the ways in which my own Navajo Diné people understood their philosophy, their pedagogy. I've explored all of this. I've done some readings. I'm pulling those all together in my own understanding and really starting to see myself in a very different light, because I have a culture that has a very different way of knowing, understanding, and being to situate a different reality. And so again, just thinking about how do I remember that? Because I'd forgotten. Even though I grew up in the culture, was around it, and had the language, all of that was lost to me as a result of my parents' boarding school experience and all of that. So again, there's quite a bit there, and I also want to make space for us to speak. So I'm just going to kind of move forward. There's be plenty of time to kind of delve back into some of this stuff here. But what I wanted to share was just this idea of what has also helped me was, again, learning to be in community with others, specifically other Indigenous scholars who themselves were, again, finding their place within the academy as they move from their undergraduate, master's into PhD programs. What you see on the screen is actually part of a presentation that the group that you see here that are referred to as Indigenous thinkers came together. We took a course with Dr. Sheila Nicholas, who's in the bottom right-hand corner. So she created a class for Indigenous students to just be able to have writing time, to write about the things we want to write about. So what this presentation was at the American Anthropology Association recent conference in November in Baltimore, speaking about what does it mean to practice Indigenous rhetorical sovereignty, meaning what does it mean like to now be able to speak about the things that we want to speak about in the manner in which we want to speak about it, but also who do we speak about this for? Who are we speaking for when we advocate using Indigenous intellectual thoughts and ideas, and how do we defend not just Indigenous life, but all forms of life, our other relations that we share this time and space with. And so again, what you see starting in the top left-hand corner, you see Sherilyn Anaya. Didn't have a photo, so we just kind of put something in there. In the middle, you see Dr. Amanda Cheremiah, who oversees the Native SOAR program at the University of Arizona. When we took the course together, she was still working on her dissertation, but when we gave the presentation, she was really honored to say that now I'm Dr. Amanda Cheremiah. Go over to the far right, you see myself. Below that is Judith Salcido, who's actually also working on a PhD. I forget what year she's in, but she joined us virtually. I have also mentioned Dr. Nicholas. In the bottom center is Dr. Beth Leonard. She's an Indigenous scholar that we've also gotten to know through another class that Dr. Nicholas created. And so she was joining us to just speak about her experience as well. And then you have Felice Tagaban Gaskin, who again is associated with Native SOAR. She has worked at the institution as well. So she joined us virtually. And then above her, you see Dr. Garrison Sinajini. Much like Dr. Cheremiah, Garrison was working on his dissertation as part of this course, and has since defended and has now become Dr. Garrison Sinajini and actually teaches in the College of Education. So again, part of this experience was just what it was like to then be in community, share these thoughts and ideas about our thoughts or ideas or writings, but what does it mean now to go to a conference and speak about that as scholars and about who we are and what does it mean to be on this journey together? What I spoke about specifically are like the four writing projects I completed as part of the class. So at the time, I was taking a course in the history of gender and sexuality here at the University of Arizona. And what these four pieces were, we had to read a specific author from the coursework and write a reflective piece. And so that's what these were. The first one was Irving Goffman's The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, speaking about in a sense, the ways in which life is somewhat a performance in Western thinking. And what does it mean to then manage? And I was focused on this idea of how do you manage sexual performance, meaning that, again, the way we as individuals are intersecting identities, these components that make us who we are, part of that is a gender and sexualized identity. But again, that in and of itself sometimes gets limited in the world that we live in right now, because again, it's based in someone else's thinking, someone else's understanding, and there's certain things that actually don't exist or occur in that reality. But within an Indigenous point of view, we have our own gender and sexuality systems that are more unique and more diverse beyond what we refer to as a binary system. Within the Navajo culture, there is actually a 5-gender system. And so what did it mean to come and understand that for the first time in my life, and to rethink about my own identity in that understanding? So that again was just some of the things that I did through these various writings. Read Michel Foucault's The History of Sexuality, The Will to Knowledge, read Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, Feminism, the Subversion of Identity, which again, really, I had to situate that only because that happened at the midst and the height of the pandemic as it was just starting, and I myself got sick. So trying to get through Judith Butler's work was quite a big task, but I got through it. And the last one was just assembling, disassembling, and reassembling knowledge bodies. So this was Dr. Ann Fausto Sterling talking about sexualizing the body, gender politics, and the construction of sexuality. So she began to study intersexed individuals who are born with both genders, what has happened to them through the medical establishment, how they're mistreated, how they have other people make determinations about what gender they would become. So again, that's really all that work. But I was just speaking about what does it mean to have read all of these, but also think about what I know about Indigenous gender and sexuality systems from my own community, but other communities that I've looked at as well, and just say that there's stuff missing here. There's Indigenous ways of knowing, understanding, and being, but also Indigenous gender and sexualities that problematize a lot of this work. But as we come to know and understand that sometimes Indigenous knowledge systems don't get acknowledged, don't get seen as valid. But I'd like to point out with number 4, that one of the things that Dr. Sterling has done is part of, after all of the study, she came to say, I believe there should be a 5-gender system. Well, it's so unique that her way of defining those 5 genders and the way she speaks about them actually aligns specifically with the Navajo gender and sexuality system. So I now have validated proof that Indigenous Diné gender and sexuality systems have been validated by Western science. So what does that mean now to have that understanding, to know that, and to try to make that step forward for others to see, know, and understand is something that I had the privilege of having to do, but also again, this understanding that I have. I know that's a lot, but I'm just going to move forward to this part where I want to speak with all of you. I know we only have about 13 minutes, but as part of the presentation, I like to write. So that was what we were speaking about, just how do people write? So this was a reflective piece that I wrote in and amongst myself for the presentation to just say, here's some creative stuff I do on the side. It's not highly academic. Sometimes I like to be reflective in just little pieces as well. So this one says, becoming someone to converse with. There are many conversations to be had. From a simple greeting to a probing question, we desire input and feedback from the world in which we inhabit. For some, conversing is as simple as breathing. For others, it's a complex reprogramming of the mind, body, and the spirit to an entirely different way of breathing or rhetorical practices. Utterable, inflective, and phonetic practices to speak about the harsh realities of empire and what it means to be Indigenous human beings surviving in a settler colonial world. So that was just my way of just trying to center this idea that when we speak about imposter syndrome, which is the topic today, it reminded me of another scholar, Dr. Tiffany Sorrell, who again works at the University of Arizona. At one point, we were working together at Native American Student Affairs, and she just kept saying this thing about, I always feel like I don't fit in, like there's this imposter syndrome and it's real. And I had to just take a moment and just say, yes, it's something we as Indigenous peoples have to kind of deal with. But the thing that we have to situate as well is that this is not our reality. We're living in someone else's definitions of the world, how it should function, how people should relate, and how people should interact with one another. So it's okay to feel uncomfortable in this space, because again, it's not the ways in which our ancestors or our people envisioned the world for not just themselves, but for future generations of their peoples. But as a result of settler colonialism, there's now another definition of the world, another definition of a human being, and another definition of our role as human beings in this reality. So we have to negotiate that space, not just ourselves as scholars, but even just in general as Indigenous peoples, recognizing that we exist in a time and place that, again, was something that our own peoples, I don't know if they foresaw it, knew it was coming. Some of them may have and made decisions to kind of limit the impact that it's having on us. But the bigger part of it all is we tend to forget now who we are, where we come from, because again, it's something that's not valued or given value by larger systems, knowledge systems like Western knowledge, or again, other systems that we participate in society. So thank you for all of that. I know we have like about 10 minutes here. I just kind of want to open up the space and see if anyone has any questions or comments. I know that's a lot, but again, just wanted to just situate where I am, my understanding, and also just sharing that all I've come to learn from everything that my ancestors or my grandparents taught me was that knowledge is something you always reflect on. So I love these opportunities to speak about what I've come to know, because your questions help me try to better understand what it is I truly know. So I'll step back. Thanks.
I don't think that I have a question, but I think that with what you just said, with your advice that you gave to Dr. Sorrell is really important in just recognizing imposter syndrome, you know, and realizing that, yeah, it is okay to feel uncomfortable with being in this space, because as we've said before, like it wasn't made for us, you know. And so along with that thread, like, do you have any advice for maybe students who are younger that are navigating this space, especially those who are like in high school, getting ready to go into college, that can be helpful as they start this academic journey? Well, not start this academic journey, but continue as they go into college.
Yeah, no, and I recognize that that's the population I'm speaking to as well, is thinking about like, where was I? Like, I think this gives me a chance to think about that. Again, I did everything I was supposed to, and then I stepped into the academy and no one warned me. It is, as I've come to share more and more with people, is I think what I've shared is that I feel like this is where the heart of settler colonialism, it's the mind and soul of settler colonialism, because this is where those thoughts and ideas emerge from. This is where you learn about all of that in terms of each specific discipline has their own core set of individuals and how they've constructed that knowledge system in whatever, if that's in natural sciences, if that's in business, if that's in English, writing, whatever you want. There are scholars within that. But again, a majority of them, or significant number of them, I would say, are non-Indigenous. And again, they're building from other knowledge systems that were brought here and continue to support that. And I think, again, one thing that I would say to someone stepping into this experience is that you know who you are. And sometimes you will feel out of place. And again, as Carol situated, this wasn't designed for us to be successful here. And I think the thing that I sometimes struggle with is this idea of I have to learn it, I have to know it, and I have to understand it. But I think that's where I like Dr. Cordova's concept of it all, which is the reason I study it the way I do is because it gives me insight. It lets me think about how others think. And some of the other scholars that I've read really speak about this idea of how do we stop settler colonialism? How do we undo some of those harms? And some of the ways they speak about is to be able to like confront it or at least speak against it. But again, that comes with stepping into this experiencing, learning what does it mean to actually put a paper together, learning about citation, doing it in a specific way, which again is not our way. Like the one thing that I situate a lot of the time speaking with people is that we speak in stories. there's more scholars that speak about stories are our theories. Again, back to Brian Brayboy, speaking about how, again, indigenous peoples were highly intelligent, created understandings that explain the entire cosmos. And they did that in their own way with their own language and all of this. And again, we discount that sometimes. So just knowing that our own people have their own deep metaphysical explanation for everything really did shift everything for me. But again, that also took years of reading, writing, reflecting, thinking about my own lived experience. But the one thing I think I came to learn really from Dr. Absalon, which is we are all emerging scholars. We are all moving into fields that may not have been moved into yet by other Indigenous scholars, or if there have, there are very few of them. And so the one thing that I've learned from her work too is the idea that trust yourself. One thing that was situated for me was the idea that you are the research instrument. Everything flows through you. So the more you know who you are, where you come from, that's what filters all of that through. And again, sometimes we don't know who we are and where we come from. We have to situate that reality for a majority of our Indigenous students right now, which is some may know they're Indigenous, but some may not. Some may know the degree to which, again, Indian blood or enrollment, there's just all of these things that, again, we have to recognize, and I have to situate for myself, that I'm privileged to have come from one community, come from a community that got to return to its homeland, and it wasn't fully taken away, but still is being taken away in different other ways over time. And so it's really different. But again, just this idea of you got here, and this is the part I think that was hard for me to also understand, was that I got here on my own merit. Whether people will say and will discount your getting here, that shouldn't undo all the work that you've put in to get here. There will be doubt. People will have that. It will be passed on to you by others. You can choose to take it up, or you can choose to just say, no, I'm an Indigenous scholar. My people had their own way of thinking, knowing, understanding, and being. I'm here to understand and try to learn as much of that if I can, or I can go home and learn that as well. We have to situate that as well, is that there are highly intelligent Indigenous peoples who know all of this about themselves and their people and their community and didn't come to college to study it. But again, everyone has a way of, again, making sense and making meaning of their own experience. And I think my only closing thought, again, is just this idea that you are the research instrument. So everything flows through you, whatever method works for you. If it's creating flashcards, if it's writing it down, if it's creating a picture, creating artwork. I'm going to kind of move us back a little to kind of just situate something here real quickly. So the third book, Dr. Gregory Hette's work, that is actually an image he created after everything that he'd learned. And so here's another way of like remembering things, is to put it into artwork. And that's what our Indigenous communities did. And this is something that doesn't get spoken about very much, is the idea that even within, I'm wearing a necklace here, this is in honor of my grandfather, but even within this necklace is the Navajo creation story, even about the separation of the genders and the sexualities and how they came back together. Like our artists in our own communities were using jewelry and design to take all of this knowledge and understanding and pass it on. So this is available to us as well. But again, just what I was situating was just this idea that Dr. Kahete uses artwork to communicate his thoughts and ideas, to capture them. That's okay. If you need to journal, if you need to sketch something out, whatever works for you, it's a perfectly valid method. And again, you are just figuring out how to incorporate and digest all of this information and to make sense of it. But it flows through you as the individual. And again, I think that's why it was important to say this is where, again, knowing who you are, where you come from is one component of that. But again, it's hard for us as Indigenous scholars because some of us were kept from that, not allowed to even think about, and we were in some sense dismembered from our own understanding of who we could be as a result of settler colonialism. I hope that answers your question.
Any other questions? So, Nick, how, when a young student comes in, a freshman, what would you recommend them doing when they start going into classes that are predominantly non-native? They start feeling that uncomfortable feeling of, who am I? Or how did I get here? Or who am I? Where would you navigate them to look for support?
Oh, well, I used to work for Native American Student Affairs. So that's, again, one place that you can go to. It's a center, cultural center specifically for our Indigenous peoples. But again, we also have to recognize that, again, our peoples are made up of multiple identities as well. So again, just even in our introductions, you could see that we are made up of more than just what people refer to as American Indians. We have to start to situate broader and broader that indigeneity is beyond just Native American peoples, that there are indigenous peoples globally. There are our indigenous relatives to the south in what we consider South America. There's peoples to the north in Canada. So again, just there's cultural centers for people to go to, have a space to speak. There's clubs and organizations. There's Native Voice, Native SOAR is a class that can be taken. There's the Otham-Key Living Learning Community, where you can live in community with other Indigenous scholars, but also take classes together. So again, there's a lot of opportunity there. But I think the other thing that I should situate is that even through my master's and PhD program, I had to find a place outside of the academy where I could be with other Indigenous peoples. And that came through my service. That came to just meeting some elders who would sign me up for various things. And suddenly I was doing this work. So even if it's just looking and finding someone and finding elders, or even some of the scholars I mentioned who are now professors at the University of Arizona, they're more than welcome and would be excited to hear from students about their experience. Native SOAR is a great program because it, again, allows you to take some college credit, but you also get to be a mentor to an undergraduate student. But at the same time, you get assigned a graduate mentor, but you also work really closely with an Indigenous PhD as well, a professor or faculty member. So there are various programs at the campus there to kind of help with that. But I think what I was speaking to is that even for myself, I had to find a place where I could do my service, feel like I was giving back to community, because I was always raised to serve community, be in relation to community. And I realized that that was what had been missing from my first journey, was I was here strictly for the academic. Yes, I was dealing with trauma and other things, but I still made it through that, went on to get my undergraduate degree, but I had a different community then. It wasn't entirely Indigenous. It wasn't until I came back for my master's and I really started to delve into identity construction, all of these things that are associated with making up someone and who they are as part of my master's program. And that's when I started becoming more purposeful to say, I need to be in community with other Indigenous peoples. And as a result of that, I started to speak about how suddenly I found myself again. I felt back at home, even though I was far away. So again, there's plenty of opportunities to reach out. And I know that's hard. I recognize that even when I was younger, I very rarely interacted with people. I tried to, but it was sometimes hard. But we also have to situate that it also is hard in classes when you're in a class of 500 people and you're looking around and you may be the only Native in that space. That is hard to negotiate. And I know, again, that's part of what made me feel incomplete. Even though I was also living on a wing of Native students, there was something there. The one thing I will situate, and this is just me deeply sharing, is that what was hard was that I came into that community, but I was seen by even my own group there that I wasn't Native enough. I was referred to the apple of the group. I was supposedly red on the outside, but white on the inside. And I didn't know why I was being treated that way. But unfortunately, that's some of the things that have come as a result of settler colonialism, is we've learned this tradition of dismembering people, saying you're not part of our group. You may be Native, but you're not Native enough. These are all things that even we do amongst ourselves that we need to stop doing. But again, that's back to that idea of we're taught this through settler colonialism of how do we not only dismember other people, but how do we dismember ourselves? How do we see ourselves less and less of who we are? And so again, back to this idea of having that belief. But I think one thing I speak about a lot was this idea that I had to have others believe in me until the point that I started to believe in myself. So that's where having elders or other people that you can go to that will believe in you. They could be the individuals working at Native American Student Affairs, could be Carol, could be Rudy, could be Natalia. Every one of these individuals that I just spoke about have done some amazing things for students in so many ways that's hard to say, but they do it out of what we've come to learn from our own communities of how to give back, how to serve others, and how to, again, be, I guess, in a way, indigenous, going back to those methods. And so again, it can be found, it's hard, it's a struggle, but the other thing to share is just start sharing openly what you're going through. I know it's fearful, I know it's hard, but once you start to do, you'll find others and they'd be like, I feel the same way too. And you can start then forming your own communities of people who understand and have a sense of your own experience, and suddenly you don't feel so alone anymore. Because although it may be individual and it may not seem like it's the same, we're all experiencing it very similarly, but again, in very different, unique ways because of our own circumstances, but it's still shared, I guess is the way to share it. So.
Thank you, Nick.
I just want to say thank you, because I mean, you just have delivered a lot of profound messages today about this topic. And I'll be honest in that, like, you know, I think as I came in, and I'm thinking somebody's going to speak to imposter syndrome. I'm always looking for the solution, and that's going to be easy to kind of pass on to our students. And it's a hard message to pass on to our students, that these are systems that, again, may not have been constructed for us. But I do feel that there is a strength in what you are offering as things that kind of have helped you, which I look back on my own kind of educational journey. And I think back to coming from a school where 90% of the students were also Hispanic. And so then coming to a university and not seeing people that look like me, and all of a sudden I needed to connect with my culture. And I sought the cultural center, the Chicano Hispano Student Affairs office at the time. And that really kind of meant something, that it was this return to who I was, even when I was immersed in it and I wasn't realizing how important culture was to me. It was only when I was taken out of that then it kind of really made that essential for me, made me need to seek it out. And you talked, again, wonderfully about communities that you seek within the institution. I thought it was interesting, kind of, these really thoughtful mentorship opportunities that Native SOAR creates, where people are not only mentoring youth, but then they're also being mentored by elders in the community, elders in quotations there, because there is this, how do I realize that people can look up to me and that I can look up to others as well. And that's like that maybe ultimate agency against imposter syndrome, right? Is that finding of yourself, both by kind of helping, but also by being helped as well. So just a lot of things that you made me kind of think about. It was different than what I came in kind of expecting, but I think really wonderful. And like I said earlier, I think some profound words that are going to have me continuing to think about, like, what do we do? And that I think your message is that, until we can get into these positions that you're working to get into, positions that you've mentioned that your colleagues have been able to get into, where over time the institution can be changed over time, the system can be changed, hopefully, or slightly, to kind of allow for less of that feeling of a system that's not welcoming. So I don't know if anything of what I said made sense, but I just wanted to say that I think a lot of what you said today has made sense to me, and I hope to others too. Thanks.
Oh, I appreciate that. And again, I think that was something I thought about too. Do I do the traditional, like, here's the definition of imposter syndrome, but then I had to like step back and just be like, what do I know? What do I understand? But also the part that's hard to really think about all of this too is just, what do I share? There's so much to be shared, and like this should be like another hour to just really delve into even the works that you're seeing again on the screen, because they offer so much. They really have helped me recognize that we as Indigenous peoples, back to Cordova, situate our relationship to everything else in a very different manner. And as a result of that, we understand things differently. And I think the best way I situate it is like, if we look around to everything in the world, it's all data, right? In some sense. What's different in the way I speak about it now is the idea that we as Indigenous people just categorized it differently. We also give it respect. And as a result of that, there's something about our knowledge systems that are very different and very unique. And when you step into and you've grown up with that tradition, I think the one thing I forgot to situate is that my grandfather was a medicine man, knew the songs, knew all of those things deeply because he used it to heal people. And I grew up within all of that, but I grew up within a large network of family and community of not just my 15 aunts and uncles, but also all of my grandparents' brothers and sisters. So I have a kinship system that's over 200 plus people. And so when I came here, not only did I step away from my community, but something you made me think of was this idea of you step out of your knowledge system because you're disconnected from it. And what I wrote about in one of my pieces was, it wasn't until I started to incorporate community back into my understanding that suddenly things shifted, things changed. And that's something Cordova brings up, which is this idea that we are communal people. Anyone, we have always been, but there's this thing within Western knowledge systems that focuses on two specific things: the idea that we are individuals, but also this idea of the human singularity. And what she speaks about is this idea that in Western ways of knowing, understanding, and being, the human thing that we come to know and understand in that creation system is of the belief that was created separate from all of this. And as a result of thinking it's separate, we then have, again, we only focus on the human individual, the human form of life, and that's all that's important. But our knowledge system recognized, like, no, that's not the way we are. We are a product of everything around us. And this is something I share with some of my students, is the idea that I'm a human being and I breathe oxygen as a result of everything around me, meaning the plants give off oxygen, I take it in, it fuels my life force, and then I exhale carbon dioxide, which the plants take in and fuel their life source. So there's a relationship there. So even just within that, it's just a different understanding, a different treatment of the data, but also the categorization of phenomena, just things that happen. Indigenous peoples have their own explanation for these phenomena, but we also structure it in a very different way. And so it's an entirely different reality, but also something I speak about. It's in a highly different way of being human that, again, has always been offered by every Indigenous community to everyone else, to say, here's what we have to offer. There's something different, where we don't create individuals, we create community members. We create individuals who don't think of themselves, but think about others and giving back to them, because they know in that giving, someone else is thinking about me, so my needs are taken care of. So it's a whole entire different way of really looking at and situating reality, but also how do you come to talk about that? And how do you go from such a broad understanding and bring it down to like the very individual relationships that we have? And so again, thank you for allowing me to just reflect even more. But again, it's just so complex, but it goes back to that idea of imposter syndrome, because again, if we're speaking about not feeling that you were in the right space or something's wrong, part of that has to do with we are from peoples who have different definitions of the world, human being, and the role of a human being. But as a result of that, our ways we think about our relationships, our behaviors, our actions, all are different, but also get explained very differently because they have different logic systems, even within and amongst themselves. And to truly know and understand them is to have to live through it and experience it and go through the songs, the dances, which again was something I was never allowed to participate in. As a result of my parents' boarding school experience, my mother was very much, we will never teach you Navajo. I'm like, if you pick it up yourself, that's great, but we're doing this because we don't want you to be harmed. My mother shared stories about how in boarding school, when she used to speak Navajo, one of her punishments was to hold dictionaries outside on both sides of her hands, how her arms gave out. So again, these were like intentional trying to erase who we were and to have us forget, and that gets passed down. So that's, again, a choice that was made for me. But again, I was treated differently because I didn't speak the language. And that even speaks to how we have learned from this idea of dismembering people because they don't speak the language, because they don't know who they are, where they come from. But we forget that there's a system that has been imposed to help us forget, that punishes us if we try to remember, I think is one way to situate it. So thank you.
Thanks, Nick. I think everything that you said about community, we've sort of talked about in programming and stuff that we've done. We just applied for the student services fee funding again, and that's what we talked about with like Native SOAR and with NASEP about how providing the funding allows us to fund students to get involved and connected with community, to find leadership on campus. And it's funny because we know that how important that is just from what you're saying with how we view the world and stuff. And so it's really important. And I think that we've seen it, even if we haven't been conscious about how impactful it is. Does that make sense? Like, we see that it's important, but with the works that you brought up, just sort of reinforcing how important it is. And so just hoping that that is seen by people who make decisions on program funding, stuff like that, because it has made an impact with our students. And I think that, yeah, finding community is a great way to combat imposter syndrome, knowing who you are, giving purpose to yourself, and having individuals who respect your gifts and acknowledge your place and allow you to continue to grow. So I think that those are all important things that you talked about, and things I'm taking away as we've learned and everything conversed in this session. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. And again, I think about how, again, it's just, we forget and it's easy. And I think that's something that another scholar situated for me, or an elder, was the idea that when we practice or we go into the classroom all the time, and we're told to introduce ourselves, we tend to just make it quick and simple because we sometimes feel embarrassed when we have to introduce ourselves in the traditional manner in which we taught. So it's picking up that tradition again and saying, it's okay. This is a space where it's the academy. We should be able to do that. It's a place where these things get discussed. And it's how do we encourage and create and let other people know that you're in the one place where it can be on full display, and that there are so many ways to intersect with it and interact with it in a way that you couldn't before. So maybe that's the message to the next generation, is that if you ever wanted to know anything and everything about yourself, others, peoples, your identity, who you are, reality, time, this is the place you get to do that. But the part that's hard is you have to learn all the other ways that other people have thought about it. But the nice thing is you also get the opportunity to explore for yourself anything about your peoples, who they are, where they come from, but you also get to weave yourself into that. You get to tell your story because you are part of those peoples. You have stepped into something that many people have very rarely have the opportunity to do. Like I think about just my privilege of how fortunate I am to be where I am today. And it wasn't an easy journey, but here I am. But again, here's a place that has allowed me to do that. But it's a challenging space because they want citations. They want to know, where did this come from? And they'll sometimes say it can't just be from your grandmother, but in many places we can say, why not? She's a valid source of knowledge. So again, it's just those hard conversations that also wear people down over time. And I also know that that's also part of that imposter syndrome as well, is this idea of always having to defend who you are or be either mislabeled, because that sometimes happens in the academy, misgendered, which sometimes is something new that's also occurring as well. So again, it's just all of those things. But as you mentioned, community, and this is something that Dr. Kahete speaks about, community is where Indigenous peoples can be whole. This is where Indigenous knowledge can be the greatest, but it only happens when you're in relation to people and talking to people and interacting with people and creating traditions. You may create new traditions here with Indigenous scholars here within the space, which I spoke to earlier. Like I created a space with others who are from different cultural backgrounds, but we come together and we speak about our work, talk about what we've come up with, what we've uncovered in our journey. And even just that space in and of itself has been so helpful to me. And again, but it's always that process though, of how do you move from that fear of, I don't want to talk about myself because it will open all these questions, because that's another thing that happens in the classroom is when they start to speak about Indigenous people, suddenly everyone's focused on you to be the spokesperson for all Indigenous peoples. And it's okay to say, I can't really speak for them all. I can just speak about my own lived experience. This is what I've come to know. But again, the part that I should situate too is that our limited understanding of ourselves is as a result of, again, settler colonialism, something much larger, and these larger systems that are there to basically help us forget. And it's okay to feel like you've forgotten. But again, you're now in a space where you can begin to explore those to whatever level you want. And I say that only because I've been delving into Navajo philosophy, pedagogy, not pedagogy and development, but just Navajo gender and sexuality, Navajo masculinity. So these are things that I'm going really deep in on. And that's really just fun for me. But again, that's everyone's will kind of find their own thing, their own journey. But back to what Dr. Absalon says on the far right, which is you're discovering your methods, whatever method that is that you use to make sense of all of this. Just trust that. And that was something I had to come to learn to believe, is that I got here on my own merit because I did these things. So think about what works for you in high school, what worked for you in elementary school. And the one thing that we're forgetting here is that the community, that's what was missing from my transition. I didn't have that community. I was missing a part of myself. But once I found that, then suddenly I started to make more strides in my work and my understanding, because I was back in my knowledge system again, I guess is the best way to situate that. So thank you. And then what I'll do is just move us forward. I know, again, we'll just go through these slides here, but just wanted to just give the references. So if anybody wanted to see all of this, these are the actual works that I used here today. There's plenty more. And as Natalia was speaking, like that's my bookshelf. Those are all of my books that I've read. So just read, enjoy, have a great time. And again, thank you for the time. If you need to get a hold of me, here's my email address. Thank you for spending time with me this evening and allowing me to speak in the way in which I do, and allowing me to understand even myself a little more. And isn't that all of the beauty of like learning, is we come to understand ourselves more and more through relationships and spending time with people. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. Natasha, do you have any questions for Nick coming from a high school point of view?
No, not really. I don't have any questions, but I did relate to when you mentioned imposter syndrome. Like there have been times where me and my family have gone to Phoenix and we would be at the mall and like in some stores there would be nothing but white people and we would be the only like people of color. So I felt really uncomfortable and awkward and I didn't and like I just like wanted to leave and come back home because like I felt really like awkward there and I didn't like want to be there anymore. So yeah, thank you for presenting and I enjoyed your presentation.
Oh, thank you so much. It's great to hear from you. And you're reminding me of one last thing that I shared with some of my students long ago. Like this was even before I was teaching when I was with like American Indian alumni scholars and doing the monthly workshops, which is if you ever forget, just know that wherever you go, you're on Indigenous lands. You are home. You are where you belong. So if you forget and you just need to go out and touch the soil and breathe it in, you can do that. That is a tradition you can create. But again, just regardless of how it feels, you know you're in those uncomfortable spaces where you're around others who, and you're the only person of color, but also you're the only Indigenous person sometimes. But all I can tell you is that if it gives you solace, just know that wherever you go, even on the campus of the University of Arizona or any campus anywhere in the United States or in this half of the world, you're on Indigenous lands. And that, again, is why I think, again, back to this idea of understanding our relations and knowing that, again, we're connected to all of this in a very different way is also important to remember. So thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Nick. And with that being said, any last questions or thoughts, comments before we close the session?
Great job.
Thank you.
Let's unmute and give Nick a round of applause. Thank you, Nick. Thank you. Appreciate your presentation. It was excellent. And if you want to stick around afterwards, then we can just kind of go over and discuss the presentation itself. So with that, I would like to excuse the students and we can stop the recording.